Hi, and welcome to another episode of Gary Talks. It's WrestleMania weekend. This is like the high, holy weekend of wrestling. You know how some people only go to church on Christmas or Easter? Some people only watch wrestling at WrestleMania. And then those of us that watch all year long, this is the pinnacle of the entire year. It's exciting. I've been looking forward to it, especially this one. And in honor of this year's WrestleMania, I wanted to go over my top 10 WrestleManias of all time.
Gary Talks Wrestling. Gary Talks Wrestling. Gary Talks Wrestling.
As I said in my video I made before the Royal Rumble about my top 10 favorite wrestlers of all time, I'm a lifelong fan. And nothing sums that up more than WrestleMania. And we're looking at WrestleMania 40. Now, I was too young to be able to go to a closed circuit television for WrestleMania 1 or 2, and honestly, there probably wasn't one anywhere near where I lived out in the middle of nowhere. So it was really WrestleMania 3 was the first one that caught my attention. And that will factor in later. WrestleMania 3 is on this top 10 list. I've been to a couple WrestleManias, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And there are some WrestleManias that are just heads and tails above others. I would say probably my top 6 of these 10 WrestleManias are top to bottom great cards. The other 4 in my top 10, sometimes it's all about the crowd, or a match or two, or just something that was going on in the storytelling. But all 10 of these are a lot of fun, and they're ones I will rewatch from time to time. So let's start with number 10. WrestleMania 22 from Chicago. This is a WrestleMania that really turned out well because of the crowd. Chicago crowds are one of the best wrestling crowds that come to professional wrestling. They're loud, they're boisterous, they'll sometimes boo the good guys and cheer the bad guys, and it was one of the first real audiences I noticed that with. New York City is another one that's like that, and Toronto as well. But WrestleMania 22, the audience really took control in the main event of the Triple H versus John Cena match. We all loved the Cena Thuganomics character. We loved it, like we couldn't wait for him to be champion. And then, when he became champion, he became the you can't see me, make a wish guy that now we all love, that John Cena. But at the time, we couldn't stand it. We couldn't stand how this really cool guy was being whitewashed into a kiddie wrestler. So what did people do? They rebelled. And they started cheering Triple H and booing John Cena. And this is one of the first times I remember getting that yay, boo, punching thing, which was a lot of fun. This also has probably the most hardcore match in the history of WrestleMania, which was Mick Foley versus Edge. I mean, it's the table that Edge took Foley through the flaming table. And remember, Foley was wearing like a shirt in flannel, and Edge wasn't. It was a crazy spot, and it's one I doubt we ever see again at a WrestleMania, let alone probably not in the WWE. WrestleMania 26 comes in at number 9 for me. Now, mainly this is a one-match show. Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, the streak versus the career. We all pretty much knew that Shawn was not going to win this one, but Shawn, who is my favorite wrestler of all time, is so good, he almost made you believe in times that this was it. He was going to put The Undertaker down. He was going to end the streak. And of course, we know that wouldn't happen for a few more years, but it is one of the greatest matches in the history of WrestleMania. There is also one of the worst matches in the history of WrestleMania, but it's so bad and so uncomfortable that I really like it. Now, you have to know, I'm a guy who I'll watch bad movies. I love bad movies. And there's a thing that happens sometimes when that movie is so bad, it's good. Or it's so uncomfortable to watch that it's good. And that's what happened with Bret Hart versus Vince McMahon. Bret, of course, his career was over by this point after the Goldberg kick and the concussion. And, you know, not that Vince was ever a great wrestler to begin with, but his best matches were behind him too. So what we ended up seeing was Bret Hart working out his therapy as he just beat the shit out of McMahon with the chair over and over and over again and just let go of all that frustration after Vince screwed him over at the Montreal Screwjob back at Survivor Series 97. We also got Cena versus Batista, which wasn't maybe a fantastic match, but looking back now, it is pretty cool, as both guys have gone on to great success in Hollywood. It might not be one of those WrestleManias that people remember that much, but everyone remembers that main event. It was a good one. Speaking of how a WrestleMania can be remembered for one really good match, my number 8 pick is WrestleMania 18. There's not that much special about it. I mean, the Toronto crowd was hot, they were having a good time, but just nothing really worked for that WrestleMania. It seems like it's a very middle of the road WrestleMania, one that you wouldn't even think about that much. But we had one match that is one of my all-time favorites, and that was The Rock versus Hulk Hogan. And even when this match was announced, it was like, what? I mean, Hulk Hogan's best days were far behind him. The Rock was still The Rock. We loved him, but it was like, what's going on? It's hard to buy the NWO and WWE, and just, it wasn't really working. There was even an episode where the Hulkster got in a semi-truck and, ran into Rock's car and should have killed him or something. It was ridiculous. There was no way that this match should have worked. And it wouldn't have worked if it weren't for the crowd. The crowd decided that they were going to cheer Hulk Hogan over The Rock, regardless that Hogan was supposed to be a bad guy, regardless that The Rock is the people's champion. The people decided, we are happy to see our hero, Hulk Hogan, back in the ring, and we're going to cheer him. And The Rock, being the professional he is, played into it. As soon as he realized that the crowd was booing him, he turned heel. He played the bad guy in the match, and it was great. Now, is this some technical masterpiece? Well, I mean, it's got Hulk Hogan in it, and as much as I love him, he's never really had what you'd call a 5-star match. But this match was memorable. It was one of my favorite matches of all time, and that's why WrestleMania 18 has made number 8 on my list. Coming in at number 7 for me is WrestleMania 30. This is where the Yes movement happened. When the WWE didn't want to push Daniel Bryan, they wanted it to be Batista coming back, Batista beating Orton. That's what they wanted. And the people who would have been happy to see Batista didn't want Batista. We wanted Daniel Bryan. And it's another case of the audience making their opinion so big that it changed the course of WrestleMania. Something that I think all of us watching right now can see happening again. Yes, I am a Cody crybaby. The people were so behind Daniel Bryan that they had to change things and say, okay, Daniel Bryan will fight Triple H. And if he can beat Triple H, he can get in the main event. And of course, we all know Triple H was kind of the proxy of the ownership of WWE. So it just felt like, literally, Daniel Bryan was fighting for his life against the people that didn't want him to succeed, that didn't want him to be our champion. And because you could never really know what Triple H was going to do, there was that chance that Triple H was going to beat Daniel Bryan and just, they would go with the main event that they wanted. But he didn't. Daniel Bryan came back, fought in the main event, and won the championship. It was one of the best endings to a WrestleMania I can remember. I'm hoping WrestleMania 40 ends in another triumphant way that'll be fun. That was the storyline that we were all really following at WrestleMania 30. But WrestleMania 30 also had the most shocking moment I've ever seen in a wrestling ring. And that was when Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker and ended the streak. The streak was such a big deal. It seemed like it was probably never going to end, that Undertaker was going to retire with it intact, or if someone was going to beat the streak, it was going to be some young up-and-coming guy that would use it on his resume. But no, Brock Lesnar pinned The Undertaker. And I remember seeing it, and I thought someone made a mistake. That referee's going to get fired for this. This is horrible. We all know the one shot of the dude in the audience and his eyes are bugged out. I think we all felt that way. Of course, we now know that was the plan all along, but it made such a big, memorable moment. So between that and the Yes movement, it puts WrestleMania 30 solidly in my top 10. What makes my number 6 pick really special to me is it was the first one I ever got to see live on pay-per-view. I lived out in the boonies. We didn't have cable. So pretty much if I wanted to see any of the pay-per-views, I had to wait for it to come out on VHS, rent it. I would copy it off on another VHS tape so I could watch it over and over and over again. And this was back in the time when, you had 4 pay-per-views a year. I got to see the syndicated wrestling shows like Superstars or whatever with my rabbit ears, but I wasn't able to really watch the stuff that was on cable. I didn't have pay-per-view. When I got to high school, we moved to a place that had cable. So I was able to watch primetime wrestling. I was there when Raw started. But this place didn't have pay-per-views. Like you couldn't order pay-per-views. So again, I had to wait, rent it on VHS whenever it came out. But then, just as I'm getting ready for college, we moved to a place where you can order pay-per-views. And the very first pay-per-view I ever ordered and watched live was WrestleMania 10. So that alone makes it really special to me. But this also had what was, at the time, my favorite wrestling match of all time. The ladder match between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon. This blew my mind. Yeah, now that I know more about ladder matches, I know that Bret Hart had done some. I knew that this had come from like Canada. It had played before, but we had never seen it in WWF at the time. And it was amazing. Now, granted, also, you look at it compared to the wrestling matches that came later with Edge and Christian and the Dudleys and the Hardys, like, there wasn't a whole lot huge happening. But these two guys, two professionals, two of the greatest of all time, knew how to tell a story. And the match was so good that this was, until Hell in the Cell, the match that I would show non-wrestling fans to be like, this is as good as wrestling gets. That ladder match was great. We also had the whole Bret Hart and Lex Luger both trying to fight to win. Bret beating Yokozuna, winning the championship, all the wrestlers putting him on his shoulders. It was a great, happy moment to end WrestleMania, which I, again, hope we get another moment like that this year at WrestleMania 40. Also, WrestleMania 10 had, for my money, the greatest opening match in the history of WrestleMania, and one that will probably not be topped. And that was the Battle of the Brothers, Owen Hart versus Bret Hart. It was a great, flawless, tactical match. You felt like these guys hated each other. And, shock of shock, Owen beats Bret. It was unexpected. Most of us thought Owen was this whiny little crybaby brother that Bret would put him in his place, but he didn't. And Owen beat the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, which then played in later when Bret came back, beat Yokozuna, won the championship, and then Owen just couldn't believe it. He finally had one-upped his brother, and his brother had to go and win the championship, which led to their awesome feud that went for years until his hated brother Bret became Owen's lovable brother Bret, and they started the Hart Foundation again in my greatest favorite feud of all time, Bret Hart and Team Canada against Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, and USA. But WrestleMania 10, forever, is one of my favorites. I mentioned it earlier, but coming in at number 5 is WrestleMania 3. Pontiac Silverdome, the supposed 93,000 fans. And I know that number isn't exactly true, but man, that place was packed. I remember when this was happening, and like I said, I didn't have pay-per-view. I didn't have access to closed-circuit TV, so I had to wait for the VHS, which seemed like forever. And I remember they even announced on the local news that Hogan beat Andre. Spoiler, guys, thanks a lot. But finally, I got that clamshell VHS tape and watched WrestleMania 3, and that Hogan-Andre match is everything that 1980s wrestling was. You had the great hero, the superhero Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, the stinky wart-infested monster, and Hogan picked him up over his head, body slammed him for everyone. It was a great, fantastic wrestling match for fans. And we also got one of the greatest wrestling matches of all time, Macho Man Randy Savage versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. It was just probably the greatest tactical match that had been in WWE, WWF, at that time. Still to this day, and we've seen great, great tactical matches, it holds up and is one of the best of all time. I know WrestleMania 3, for those of you that weren't around then, is probably like, kind of a ho-hum WrestleMania. Almost the way I look at WrestleMania 1, because I wasn't really watching it yet at that time. You look back, you can say, yeah, okay, I get it. I see how it was important to the history of the company, but it's not that great of a card. And I can agree with you on that on WrestleMania 3. But for those of us that were there, that were fans, that were little kids, WrestleMania 3 is always going to have a very high place in our hearts. Coming in at number 4 for me is one that not only ranks this highly because of how good a card it is It's because it was the first WrestleMania I ever got to see in person. WrestleMania 21. I had just moved to Los Angeles a couple years prior, and I was broke. I had no money. I had some little job at MTV, not making much at all. But I was able to get nosebleed rafter seats by myself for WrestleMania 21. I was so high up at the Staples Center, it was hard to see the ring. But it was great, just being in the atmosphere. And going by yourself to a wrestling show seems like it might be kind of sad, but there's such a camaraderie of fans that you become friends with everyone around you. You're high-fiving people, you're booing, you're cheering, and just being at a WrestleMania, it was a lifelong dream for me at that point. But what a WrestleMania it was. I mean, we had that Piper's Pit with Austin and Rowdy Roddy Piper. It was great seeing them share a ring together. We had the greatest match I have ever seen in person. The Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels versus Kurt Angle. It was flawless, a 5-star match. I think it was probably called the best match of the year, and certainly the best one I've ever seen in person. Not my favorite match I've seen in person, that was the Undertaker Shawn Michaels Hell in a Cell, but that'll be for a different Gary Talks down the road. We got to see John Cena win his first championship match against JBL, and we saw Batista finally become champion and beat Triple H in what was a really awesome story of Batista getting sick and tired of being used by Triple H in Evolution and finally winning the belt. It was all around a really fun WrestleMania, and it had the very first Money in the Bank ladder match. I know now it's happened so much, it's become its own pay-per-view, and it doesn't mean that big a deal. But it was insane seeing it, and seeing it in person. And it had a who's who of future Hall of Famers. We had Chris Jericho, Edge, Christian, Kane, Shelton Benjamin, and a certain no way future Hall of Famer in Chris Benoit. It really was a mind-blowing match, and just top to bottom, WrestleMania 21 was very entertaining. Coming in at number 3 for me is the WrestleMania that was really kicking off the Attitude Era. And that was, as I have on my shirt right here, WrestleMania 14. I mean, Austin, Tyson, HBK, that whole storyline alone really saved the WWF at the time, helped them beat WCW, and changed the trajectory of professional wrestling. And what a match it was. And we didn't know it at the time, but Shawn Michaels was in such bad back pain. He could barely move, but he toughed it out and put on a great match. There were also stories that they weren't sure what Shawn was going to do, and Undertaker was there ready to knock Shawn Michaels out if Shawn refused to lose to Steve Austin. All that just makes for some great behind-the-scenes stuff, but it was an awesome, fun match. And this being the start of the Attitude Era, we had Undertaker versus Kane for the first time. We had Triple H versus Owen Hart, who was fighting for the honor of his brother Bret. We had New Age Outlaws versus Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie, who was Terry Funk. And just being able to see Cactus Jack at WrestleMania was also something that was mind-blowing at the time for us. Yeah, we'd seen Mankind, but we had never seen Cactus Jack on the grandest stage of them all. We also had The Rock versus Ken Shamrock, and this was when The Rock was still with the Nation of Domination. We had kind of moved beyond Rocky Sucks, which we had done Rocky Sucks when he was the good guy, Rocky Maivia. But at this point, he was starting to show in the Nation of Domination the personality that would make him the people's champion. And he's fighting Ken Shamrock, who probably has no personality, but looked like he could legitimately kill you. And it was a really fun match, and it seemed like that kind of launched The Rock, which then next year he would already be in the main event as the champion. But WrestleMania 14 is definitely my number 3 WrestleMania of all time. Coming in at number 2 of my favorite WrestleManias is WrestleMania 23. Yeah, the one with Donald Trump and Vince McMahon and the head shaving match, and I know a lot of you were like, what? WrestleMania 23 was good and all. I mean, there was the great Batista-Undertaker match, the very good John Cena versus Shawn Michaels match, which we weren't sure if we'd ever get Shawn back in the ring again, and then for him to main event WrestleMania was a big deal. You had the Money in the Bank ladder match, which this year featured Mr. Kennedy, CM Punk, Randy Orton, Finlay, Matt Hardy, King Booker, Jeff Hardy, Edge. You got the ECW originals coming into WrestleMania. There were a lot of fun things, but I know you're saying, how could this be number 2? It's simple. My dad was my wrestling buddy. We always watched wrestling together. WrestleMania was always something we talked about going together. So when WrestleMania 23 came to Detroit, my dad and I went on the only road trip we ever had, and we drove to Detroit for WrestleMania. We had floor seats, which that was where I learned that floor seats aren't great for WrestleMania unless you're in those first couple rows. We were like in row 35 on the floor or something like that. So it was really hard to see anything. But still being there, it was like 80,000 people at Ford Field. It was great. My dad was battling prostate cancer at the time, and we didn't know it yet, but he died later that year. So the fact, I get emotional about it because of how important my dad was to me. But the simple fact that my dad and I were able to share WrestleMania 23 together and share the road trip together. And, we got to we'd never stayed in a hotel room together or anything and go out to eat together. And it was just the two of us. And it was a great experience. So for that alone to me makes WrestleMania 23 something that is pretty much untouchable. But there is still one WrestleMania that was so good, it tops even that. And my number one WrestleMania of all time is WrestleMania 17. This was basically the pinnacle, almost the end of the Attitude Era, and what a WrestleMania it was. Every single match was great. There's not one you want to fast forward through. Well, maybe China Ivory, but that was still in the time when the ladies' matches were pretty much, you were going to fast forward through them anyway. But so many fantastic, great matches on the show. You had the Shane McMahon versus Vince McMahon match, where Linda was catatonic in the wheelchair, Mick Foley was the referee. One of the biggest crowd pops ever was when Linda stood up and kicked Vince in the balls. Now, with everything that has come to light about Vince McMahon, the match is a little harder to watch now. As you know, he was very degrading to Trish Stratus, calling his wife a bitch. I guess sometimes the storylines were pretty true. But still, it's a memorable match and a lot of fun. One of my all-time favorite main events, The Rock versus Steve Austin. And this was the match where Steve Austin turned evil, joined up with the devil himself, Vince McMahon, because he had to do whatever he had to do to beat The Rock. And this brings me to probably the greatest promo video the WWE has ever made, which was the one to My Way by Limp Bizkit. If you mention My Way by Limp Bizkit to wrestling fans, they will all immediately remember this promo. That's how good it was. The fact that I'm talking about a wrestling promo when describing reasons why WrestleMania 17 is my favorite just says how good that promo was. We had the second table, ladders, and chairs match, which was just mind-blowing. Hardys, Edge and Christian, Dudleys, and then they worked in Lita, Little Spike Dudley, and Rhino. It was balls to the wall action and is my favorite tables, ladders, and chairs match ever. You also had the Gimmick Battle Royal, which was so much fun. It was a blast from the past to see all these old silly guys coming out. And you had Bobby the Brain Heenan, Mean Gene Okerlund, and now looking back, most of these guys aren't with us anymore, and it was really special. They got that one big moment at WrestleMania. I kind of wish they would do something like this again. Maybe an Attitude Era gimmick match. Something like that at a WrestleMania. Just so we can get some of these old guys we haven't seen for years, like a Gilbert. There are so many fun ones, and it would be great to see. We also had Undertaker versus Triple H was just a hard-hitting, good match. We didn't realize there would be better Undertaker Triple H matches down the line at WrestleManias, but it was really, really good. And we have a match that we don't really talk about anymore, but that was Kurt Angle versus Chris Benoit. It was a crisp, great storytelling match where they were trying to out-wrestle each other with your chain wrestling, with your traditional ground wrestling. And then finally, when Kurt Angle, the guy who won the gold medal with a broken freaking neck, when he couldn't beat Chris Benoit with wrestling, then it starts brawling, and then the match just kind of turns on, and it was a lot of fun. Even the stuff like Raven in the hardcore match against Kane and the Big Show was fun. It's just a really fun WrestleMania. And when you ask pretty much any wrestling fan, they put WrestleMania 17 at the top, or at least close to the top. So there you go. Those are my top 10 WrestleManias. I'm hoping WrestleMania 40 is going to get into that list. I know now that WrestleMania is 2 days, it gets a little harder to rank. Do you just do night 1? Do you do night 2? Do you count all 9 hours of wrestling? What do you do? but it's the first WrestleMania that I've been super, super hyped to see in such a long time. The Rock, Roman Reigns, Cody, Seth Rollins. I can't wait to see that double main event on night one, and then Cody versus Roman on night two. It's going to be a lot of fun. My expectations are high, and hopefully we get Cody finally finishing the story. Enjoy WrestleMania this weekend and come back next week when we get back to talking television as I go over my top 10 sitcoms of the 1990s. See you then.
Gary Talks Wrestling. Gary Talks Wrestling. Gary Talks Wrestling.